So in Chapter 7, we looked at one extreme, which was perfectly competitive markets. Today we're going to look at the other end of the spectrum, which is a market structure called the monopoly. Mono meaning one, so we'll talk about the characteristics of a monopolist, of a monopoly. We'll talk about the profit maximizing a little bit more like we did for perfect competition. We'll talk about why long-run profits might be different from a monopolist, and then we'll kind of compare the two outcomes at the end of this chapter. The outcome from competition versus the outcome from monopoly, and see who the winners and losers are in that case. So we said we're going to look at the kind of differentiate these markets by the number of sellers, what kind of product they produce, and how hard or easy it is to enter into the market or the industry. So in monopoly, mono meaning one, we have one single seller, and the one single seller is selling a product that is unique. It has no close substitutes. Remember, in competition, the firm was producing something that had lots of perfect substitutes, right? Lots of producers were producing kind of the exact same product there. In this case, the monopolist is able to have a monopoly because he's the only producer. So the only producer, the only seller of a unique product with no close substitutes. And then there are significant barriers to entry into the industry. So remember, in competition, entry was free and easy. New firms would enter and compete down the profits away. For a monopoly to exist, there has to be difficulty in entering the industry. In fact, it must be impossible. And there's a couple of different reasons for this. It could be that they are the owner of a resource which is very unique, so that they can be the only one who have control over that. It could be a legal barrier to entry. These we see. The government will grant patents on a good or service for a particular amount of time, usually about 20 years in the United States. And this prevents anyone from replicating and producing the same product. It might be what we looked at before when we were looking at the cost curves, economies of scale. It could be that the cost structure in the market is one so that it only makes sense to have one big seller, so that we can have one firm producing at these lower production costs. And so it makes it hard for new people to get in. So we call these natural monopolies, and we've seen them. One commonly used example is a utility, maybe the water company in a city, because the infrastructure, the cost that is required to put in water lines to everyone's house makes it hard for a new firm to get in to compete. It makes sense to have only one water company in a small town. The profit maximization, the intuition here, is the same under monopoly as it was in perfect competition. The marginal revenue is the change in revenue from producing and selling another unit of output. The marginal cost is the change in total cost from producing and selling an additional unit of output. And so what the firm manager does is compare the marginal revenue, which is the change in revenue, to the change in cost, the marginal cost. And they say, well, if the marginal revenue is bigger than the marginal cost, then that means producing an additional unit is going to increase our profits, right? Our revenue is growing faster than our cost, then our profits would be increasing. But if we reach a point where our costs are growing faster than our revenue, that is, the marginal cost is greater than the marginal revenue of producing and selling another unit, then that means profits are going to be falling. So it must be the case that profits are maximized when marginal revenue is exactly equal to marginal cost. So the profit maximization rule for the firm is to produce the quantity at which the marginal cost is exactly equal to the marginal revenue. So what we want to look at here is what the outcome would be if there were competition versus what the outcome would be when there is a monopoly. So if we think about the marginal cost curve being the supply curve in a competitive market, we can see that the supply and demand would intersect at this point here and give us this price, the competitive price, P sub C, and the firms would produce this quantity Q sub C. So price PC and quantity QC are the outcome that we would expect in a competitive market. However, the monopolist doesn't have that perfectly elastic demand curve. It has a downward sloping demand curve because it is the market. It's the only seller in the market. Because the demand curve of the monopolist is downward sloping, the marginal revenue curve that the monopolist faces is downward sloping as well. The same profit maximization rule applies. The firm finds where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost and chooses this quantity here, QM, as their quantity of output. They choose their price, the maximum price that they can sell all of those units for, is illustrated by the demand curve. So this price is PM for the monopolist. So here's the monopoly price, and here's the monopoly quantity. So if we compare these two outcomes, just their equilibrium price and quantity, what we would expect to see is that compared to perfect competition, the monopolist increases the market price and decreases the quantity of output that is produced compared to the competitive outcome. So we can say when we compare competition to monopoly, the monopolist increases price and restricts the amount of output available for sale. That means consumers are worse off on 2 points. There are some consumers, because the monopolist restricts output, there are some consumers that would be willing and able to purchase the good in the competitive market who do not even enter into transactions with the monopolist. The ones that do enter into transactions with the monopolist pay a price that is higher than they would have paid under competition. So that what we can see is that a true monopolist will restrict output and raise price so that they gain, in this case the sellers gain at the expense of consumers when we compare the monopoly outcome to the competitive outcome. So we can see that sellers would prefer to be a monopolist, while consumers would prefer to buy their output in a competitive market. By the way, the generalization that we said that the firm, the monopolist, gains at the expense of consumers doesn't imply that the people who enter into transactions with the monopolist are necessarily being ripped off. Remember that the demand curve shows willingness and ability to pay. So imagine that this monopoly price is $5 per unit. The people that are buying output, are paying $5 per unit when their actual value, their willingness and ability to pay, is at or above $5. That is, imagine if I value a good at $6 and I see the price that it's offered is $5, then I choose to enter into that transaction voluntarily, and I'm still better off than I would have been had I not entered into the transaction. I just pay a little bit more than I would have otherwise. The price discriminating monopolist is a little bit different. The price discriminating monopolist will say, in order to engage in price discrimination, the firm must be able to differentiate consumers into at least two groups that have different demand. Price discrimination is defined as charging different prices to different consumers when the cost of supplying those consumers are the same. Now, technically, price discrimination is illegal, but we see price discrimination in the world when we look out and see offers for ladies' night, where a bar might charge different prices for drinks for females than they would for males. We see price discrimination in movie tickets, where a senior citizen, an adult, or maybe a college student pays a lower price for a movie ticket than other people. We see that matinees at movie theaters cost less than the prime time 7 and 9 o'clock time slots, even though the cost of running the movie is the same in the morning as it is at night. So the cost of production are the same. The movie tickets have different prices. I would venture to say that if you went around asking people on an airplane how much they paid for those tickets, we would see that the people on the plane paid different prices, even though the cost, the average cost of production for all the seats on the plane that get you from one city to the other are the same. We see people pay different prices. A lot of restaurants have deals where kids eat free on Tuesday. Maybe families have a different demand curve for dinner at a restaurant on Tuesday night than they have for dinner at a restaurant on Friday night. See college IDs and military IDs where firms offer discounts for those particular groups of consumers. In order to be able to price discriminate, all the firm has to be able to do is differentiate these two groups and be able to identify them at low cost. And then finally, they must be able to prevent arbitrage. Arbitrage is a description of trade in a secondary market. That is, if we're gonna charge a low price to one group and a high price to another group, then we have to prevent the low price group from buying at the low price and then selling to the other group. So we think about plane tickets. I can't go buy a bunch of plane tickets and then go scalp them at the airport because the ID on the picture, or the picture ID of the person boarding the plane has to match the name on the ticket. So they're able to charge different prices in that case. We can see how that can be a problem in some industries more than the others. But price discrimination definitely does occur, but usually on small scales and usually with a small differentiation in price. So do your homework on monopolies, and we will take a look next at Chapter 9, Monopolistic Competition and Oligopoly. Thanks.